We continue our study of Luke. We are in Luke 23. We are right in the midst of the account of Jesus. I don't want to call it a trial. It was a mock trial where he is being condemned to death. The Jews, the Pharisees, the scribes, the lawyers wanted him dead because he was a threat. He posed a threat to their teaching. He posed a threat to their power. He posed a threat in so many ways. And they wanted him gone. You know, it never ceases to amaze me whenever I read the gospel accounts, when I teach, when I study it, to see the immense hatred, the deep and abiding hatred of these men toward Jesus. I can't hardly fathom that kind of hatred. But yet such hatred existed among them. In spite of the fact that Jesus did all the miracles that he performed, in spite of the fact that he raised people from the dead, including Lazarus, who had been in the grave for 3 days, and his body began to decay, and yet Jesus raised him from the dead. In spite of all of those great things that Jesus did and what he said, they still wanted to kill him. And so it should not be any shock to us today when we see that kind of hatred, that kind of animosity that is demonstrated against Jesus in our day and time. When we see that kind of hatred and animosity demonstrated toward Christians and toward the truth, it should not shock us. Jesus promised that it would happen. He told us straightforward that it would take place. And so when we see what's being demonstrated here in Luke 23, it ought to, in a sense, look familiar, because we see this kind of animosity in our day and time. So we continue in verse 23. Pilate, of course, is trying to release Jesus. He may have even began to loosen his bonds, even though Luke doesn't say it. It does tell us that he was working to try to release him, wanting to release him. And so in verse 23 it says, but they were insistent, with loud voices asking that he be crucified. Put yourself in Pilate's shoes for a moment. Pilate, of course, is this very cynical Roman procurator who thinks he's seen it all. He's stuck here in this backwater province, Judea, that is, in his way of thinking. He's stuck here in this place where he can't really advance himself like you would want. He's already put down certain rebellions. He's demonstrated that he can take hold of a situation if he so wanted. And yet now he is faced right here with a situation that has come out of left field. He wasn't even expecting this. He wasn't expecting this kind of reaction from the Pharisees and the scribes. I think I mentioned to you before that there seems to have been some sort of backroom deal that Pilate had struck, or that the scribes and Pharisees thought that they had struck with Pilate. They thought that they had an agreement with Pilate. We're going to present him to you. This man is causing insurrection, and then you're going to condemn him to death. Well, it didn't work out that way initially. And so when Pilate sees there's nothing here, there's really nothing here, and of course, according to other gospel accounts, when he hears the report from his wife about this dream she's had, and when he sees Jesus and actually converses with him in private, he's convinced there's a lot more at work here than meets the eye. He's thinking there's something far more at work as far as on a cosmic level than meets the eye. And so he's trying to release him. And as a politician, he faces this situation where you've got a massive group of people that are clamoring for the death of this individual, and it's threatening to become a riot. And if a politician is ever faced with a riot, he's going to do everything he can to settle that thing without any kind of violence or bloodshed. And that is what Pilate is doing here. I say all that because there are scholars today that say that this does not ring true. This whole situation doesn't ring true with Pilate because he was able to take hold of the situation and crush any kind of opposition. This is completely out of character, they would say, for Pilate. Well, they don't understand politicians. I'm talking about in the bad sense. Not all politicians are like that, please don't get me wrong. But as far as a cynical politician is concerned, that's what Pilate was trying to do, is keep the lid on this situation as best he can. So their voices began to prevail. Verse 24. And Pilate pronounced sentence that their demand be granted. He caved. He totally caved. Now, history outside of the Bible suggests that Pilate's wife became a Christian later on. You can take that for what it's worth. We're not told in the New Testament whether she ever did. But the tradition states that she did. We're never told if Pilate ever obeyed the gospel. In fact, everything seems to suggest that he never obeyed the truth. Verse 25, and he released the man they were asking for, who had been thrown into prison for insurrection and murder. That's, of course, Barabbas. Barabbas is released, but he delivered Jesus to their will. He delivers Jesus over. He has been scourged already. The other gospel accounts tell us that he had been scourged. Scourging, of course, I don't have to go into the detail again. We've talked about it before, about how brutal it was. How quite often an individual that is beaten in such a way would die, yet Jesus still lived. He was in very strong physical condition to be able to go through that kind of beating, that kind of torture, and not die because of the wounds. He's already a bloody mess. If you picture him in your mind, you can see the blood pouring out of his wounds, already coagulating, already soaking through his clothes. He's got the crown of thorns on his brow that they've already jammed onto his head, and the blood, of course, flowing down into his eyes and nose and mouth. And yet, he's not saying a word in his defense. He's not protesting. He's not saying, I'm innocent, I don't have to do this, I don't deserve this kind of punishment. Not a word. Not a word. And so Luke continues in verse 26, when they led him away, they seized a man, Simon of Cyrene, coming in from the country, and placed on him the cross to carry behind Jesus. Interesting. Simon of Cyrene. Simon is a man that's just picked from random in the crowd. The Roman soldiers had that authority. In case the accused man was not able to bear his own cross the entire way, then the Romans had the authority to go into the crowd and force someone, normally not a Roman citizen, to come and take that cross on his own shoulders. Simon is mentioned in other accounts as the father of two individuals, and they're named, which seems to suggest that Simon's sons are prominent members of the church later on. Simon himself likely would become a child of God, even though we're not told that specifically. The strong implication is that he did. Think about Simon, this situation he's put in. He's just coming in from the country. He has no interest, it seems, in what's going on. And all of a sudden he gets caught up in this crowd, and a Roman soldier grabs him by the arm and drags him out and says, you're going to bear his cross the rest of the way. Think about that for a moment. That kind of situation. What kind of looks did Simon and Jesus pass between each other? Was there anything said between them? The gospel accounts don't tell us if there's anything ever said from Jesus to Simon or vice versa. But you've got to know that Simon was deeply affected by this. He was a witness to the aftermath of the scourging of Jesus. It is suggested that Jesus could not carry that cross, that he had collapsed on the way. We're not told that. It's a possibility. It just says that they compelled Simon to bear his cross. And following him, verse 27, was a large crowd of the people and of women who were mourning and lamenting him. These women, as Jesus is going to indicate, are from the city of Jerusalem. And they're following Jesus, and they're weeping, they're crying, they just can't control their grief. But Jesus, turning to them, said, "Daughters of Jerusalem, stop weeping for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For behold, the days are coming when they will say, Blessed are the barren, and the womb that never bore, and the breast that never nursed. Then they will begin to say to the mountain, Fall on us, and to the hills, cover us. For if they do these things when the tree is green, what will happen when it is dry?" Jesus here is referring to the fact that there's coming a time, AD 70, when Jerusalem is going to be under far greater persecution and far greater misery and agony than Jesus is going through because of the Roman siege, because of what the Romans would do to the city. Notice when Jesus says that in verse 29 about the days are coming, it is a figurative statement that Jesus makes. But Josephus said at the end of the siege that 2,000 people were found buried alive underneath the city. 2,000 people buried alive underneath Jerusalem. If Josephus is accurate about that, and we have no reason to believe he wasn't, that's horrific. The siege and the destruction of Jerusalem was horrific indeed. It was a very significant event, no question. And Jesus acknowledges it as such. And then when he says, if they do these things when the tree is green, what will happen when it is dry? In other words, if all these things are done to me, who is innocent, what is going to happen to Jerusalem, who is rebellious? What do you think is going to happen to this city? He's telling them to prepare. Get ready for that day. 2 others also who were criminals were being led away to be put to death with him. So you've got these 2 criminals, these 2 men that are with Jesus in this time, and they're going to be put to death on either side of him. When they came to the place called the Skull, there they crucified him and the criminals, one on the right and the other on the left. John adds, Jesus in the midst, or in the middle. So, the skull, Calvary is what it's called as well. There are 2 places that are possibilities in Jerusalem, around Jerusalem, where Jesus could have been crucified. There's the traditional site, and then there's also another site which from a distance actually looks like a skull, which seems like it would be the natural place. Most evidence indicates the traditional site is probably most likely the correct place where Jesus was crucified. Unfortunately, the Roman Catholic Church has co-opted so many of those sites and built shrines, temples around them. It just completely obliterates the realism of the place. But still, this place was known. It was still known by the time that Luke would write these words. And so verse 34 says, But Jesus was saying, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. Think about this. Jesus, on this cross, he's already been nailed to the crossbar. And by the way, that crossbar weighed 100 to 125 pounds. So that gives you one reason why Jesus couldn't carry that thing all the way. He'd already been beaten to an inch of his life, and now he's being asked to carry it on his shoulders the rest of the way. He's not able to do that. Simon carries it the rest of the way, but then when they come to the place, they strip Jesus' outer clothes off of him. He most likely was completely naked. He has his clothes stripped off of him. They throw him to the ground, extend his arms out, nail the nails through in the base of his hand, because that's where the hard bone is, into the crossbar. They raise up the crossbar and put it on the upright stipes, and then they take the feet of Jesus, put one on top of the other, most likely. There was also a way that they could crucify where both legs were separated. But most likely, his feet were placed one on top of the other, one nail going through both feet into the wood. And then, of course, the titulus that would be above him, stating the accusation. So he's on the cross itself now. Every breath that you take when you're on a cross is agony, sheer agony. It's not the inhaling that's the problem. It's the exhaling. It is complete agony to exhale on the cross, because those nails are right through some very sensitive nerves, and that would shoot pain all the way through the body. And yet Jesus could say some things. And when he says, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing," he's referring to the fact that they're ignorant of what they're doing. They're ignorant. One of the New Testament writers would later say, if they had known, if the princes of this world had known, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. That's a telling commentary on what took place. If they had known. If they had known. They do not know what they are doing. And they cast lots, dividing up his garments among themselves. That was a very common thing that went on at a crucifixion as well. They would take the clothing of the accused and they would gamble for them. And in the case of Jesus, we're told in other accounts that his tunic was seamless, and it was a linen tunic. Very expensive, in fact. So this would fetch some money for these Roman soldiers. Yes, sir. Yes. That's right. That is right. Not a bone was broken in Jesus' body. And that's one reason why it is very, what am I trying to say? Very logical that the nails would go with the base of the hand, because it would actually go in between two bones, and it would transfix that hand right there on that wood. And the same thing with the feet. Sometimes our brethren, when they'll wait on the table, and I understand what they're trying to say, will say the broken and abused body of Jesus. I understand what they're trying to say, but really, he's not broken. Jesus was not broken physically, and he was not broken emotionally or spiritually. He went on his own will, by his own will, to the cross. He was the one that had control over it. But not a bone of Jesus was broken. So I sort of cringe when it is said the broken body of Jesus. No, he wasn't broken. Not a bone in him was broken. He's a perfect Passover sacrifice. Yes, sir. Yeah, in the figurative sense, yes. You've broken the body, I guess you could say that. But as far as the bones of Jesus, not a bone of him was broken. So when there's a very, very important sense where that statement is not the true. In the figurative sense, said to an extent, yes. But we've got to be, like you're pointing out, we've got to be careful as far as how we make that statement. In other words, Jesus' spirit wasn't broken by any means. He was in control right up to the time he died, as we're going to see. His emotions weren't broken, no. But in a sense, you could say, yes, his body was, quote, broken, unquote, in that sense. Yes, sir.
You know, the broken body thing, 1 Corinthians 11, verse 24, this is my body, which is broken for you. Now that's in some manuscripts, found itself into the King James
Yes.
But, so there's kind of precedent for saying body broken. But we would have to make a distinction between body and bones. And, somebody might speak of my body just so broken down. And they don't mean by that necessarily to have a broken bone.
Yeah.
And certainly we can make a distinction between broken body and broken bone.
Sure. And we've got to be careful that, we don't obsess too much on it, which I don't want you to get the idea that I am. I'm just making a point. But still, Jesus' bones were intact. His spirit was intact. He was willing to extend forgiveness to the people who were doing this. He was asking the Father to forgive them. And the time would come, by the way, 50 days later, where many of these people who had demanded Jesus to be crucified, and many of the people involved in his crucifixion would have opportunity to hear and obey the gospel. In fact, many other opportunities after that. So when Jesus says, Father, forgive them, he's looking forward to the gospel age, when the gospel would be preached. And they cast lots, dividing up his garments among themselves, and the people stood by, looking on. And even the rulers were sneering at him, saying, he saved others. Let him save himself, if this is the Christ of God, his chosen one. They can't let this alone, can they? They've got to have, they think, the last word. We've got him exactly where we wanted him, and now we can tell him straight to his face what we think about him. They don't have to hide it anymore. Their hatred comes through totally. The soldiers also mocked him, coming up to him, offering him sour wine, and saying, if you are the king of the Jews, save yourself. The Roman soldiers get in on the act. Now there was also an inscription above him, this is the king of the Jews. Luke summarizes the statement that was above Jesus. If you put all the statements together from all four gospel accounts, it would be, this is Jesus of Nazareth, the king of the Jews. That's the full statement. In Greek, Hebrew, and Latin, in fact. But that title is above Jesus on the cross. One of the criminals who were hanged there was hurling abuse at him, saying, are you not the Christ? Save yourself and us. He says, if you are who you say you are, then you could save us from this. But the other answered, and rebuking him said, do you not even fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation? And we indeed are suffering justly, for we are receiving what we deserve for our deeds. But this man has done nothing wrong. And he was saying, Jesus, remember me when you come in your kingdom. And he said to him, truly I say to you, today you shall be with me in paradise. The thief on the cross. How many times over the years have our religious neighbors brought up the thief on the cross as, they say, an example of someone who was saved by Jesus without baptism? When we will insist that baptism is essential for salvation, that baptism is essential for one to become a member of the Lord's church and to be saved, the thief on the cross will be often brought up. But is it the case that the thief on the cross was never baptized? I suggest that there is just as much evidence to indicate that the thief had been baptized as there is to indicate that he was never baptized. And the reasons are three. Number one, he knew Jesus as Lord. Notice what he said. Jesus, or Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom. So he not only knew Jesus as Lord, he also knew about the kingdom. And the third reason, he was probably a fallen Jew. Why do I say that? Because when John the Baptizer and Jesus were both preaching, what were they preaching? The kingdom of heaven is at hand. Were they not? It also indicates to us in the gospel accounts that all of Judea and all of Jerusalem came to John being baptized of him. All the region. Was this criminal, was this thief from Judea and Jerusalem? Nothing to indicate that he wasn't. What he says to Jesus indicates that he already knew who Jesus was. He addressed him as Lord, and he knew about the kingdom. So what this tells me is, by implication, he had been baptized either by John himself or by Jesus' apostles. Because remember, Jesus' apostles baptized. Jesus himself did no baptizing. What I'm pointing out is there's more evidence to indicate that he had been baptized than to say that he had never been baptized. But let's grant the possibility that the thief had never been baptized. Is he an example for our salvation today? No. The reason is because he was under the Old Testament, the Mosaic law. Jesus had not died yet. The Mosaic law was still in force. And so, to say that we can be saved like the thief is to go back to a law that's been taken out of the way. But further than that, not just the fact that this man lived under the old law. When Jesus was on this earth and when he was alive, he could save anyone in any manner in which he chose. Do you remember back toward the beginning of this gospel about the paralytic who was let down through the roof of the house to where Jesus was for Jesus to heal him? Do you remember what Jesus said? So that you might know that the Son of Man has power on earth to forgive sins. He said to the paralytic, rise, take up your bed, and walk. He'd already told him, your sins are forgiven you. They had grumbled, who is this man that can forgive sins? Jesus tells them why. That you might know that the Son of Man has power on earth to forgive sins. When Jesus was on this earth, he could forgive anyone in any manner in which he chose. He had all authority to do that. But when he died on the cross, and after his resurrection, when he gave the Great Commission, that's the only way in which people can be saved today. Belief, repentance, and baptism for the forgiveness of sins. And to say that we can be saved without baptism today is to contradict clear New Testament teaching. And to go to the thief on the cross as an example is to go to an example that has no application for us. Yes, Mark. That's right. Right.
But man steps in and tries to use that as a means to justify what we're doing, but that's not the case here. They need to look higher than that and say, if Jesus did this, there's a reason behind it. Not to contradict what he's told us, which is our plan of salvation. That's not the case.
That's exactly right. Jesus had all authority to say that. He said, today you will be with me in paradise. And I have no question that that day after Jesus died and after the thief died, guess where the thief was? He was in paradise and he is still in paradise. Jesus has that authority. He still has that authority. But today, the only way in which people can be saved from their sins is through the gospel. Obedience to the gospel. I had an older preacher tell me years ago, who lived in Warrior, Alabama, after he heard me preach on television about baptism. He wanted to meet with me and another preacher at his house, and he told me, I like a lot of what you're saying, but when you come to baptism, I completely disagree with you. He said, if I had to do it over again, I would never be baptized. Think about that for a minute. If I had to do it over again, I would never be baptized. Of course, when he was baptized, he wasn't baptized for salvation. He said that he got salvation driving in his car one day down the street of Warrior. And all of a sudden, the Lord just overwhelmed him. I said, where do you find that in the New Testament? Oh, I just know I was saved. If I had to do it again, I'd never be baptized. I would never preach baptism. How can you say that? How can you make that kind of proclamation? There is a song that is popular among some quartets and singing groups called The Criminal on the Cross. Have you ever heard that song, The Criminal on the Cross? I cannot stand that song. Because it takes this account and implies strongly that it applies to us today. That's giving a false impression, at the very least. We've got to be very careful about the impressions that we give on things of that nature. But there's no doubt that this thief was in paradise with Jesus after all these things took place. Verse 44. It was now about the 6th hour, that's 12 o'clock noon, and darkness fell over the whole land until the 9th hour, that's 3 o'clock in the afternoon, because the sun was obscured. Interesting. The sun was obscured. If you see any kind of television or movie depictions of the life of Jesus and they come to this event, what do they normally do? They show the clouds building and the rain falling and the thunder clapping. The Bible doesn't say that. It doesn't say anything about any rain falling. It doesn't say anything about any thunder clapping. It doesn't say anything about any clouds building. It just simply says the sun was obscured. How was the sun obscured? I can answer you in 3 words. I don't know. I do know it was miraculous. Was it an eclipse? I don't think it was an eclipse. I believe it was something that was specific to Jerusalem and Judea, particularly. I don't think it was worldwide. That's just my thought, my speculation. But the way the text reads, it seems that it was limited to that area, that region. There was darkness for 3 hours, from 12 noon to 3 o'clock. Implied here, to me at least, is that up to this point, the sun had been bright. In other words, I picture it as a cloudless sky. And all of a sudden, it's like somebody shuts off the sun goes dark. You think about the chills that would send up somebody's spine for that to take place. Well, it says, and the veil of the temple was torn in two. If you had been there in that temple as a priest, and all of a sudden you hear this rip, this loud ripping, and you were to look or peek in to see what took place, you would see that temple from bottom to top tearing apart. And no one's doing it. It's being done by divine means, miraculous means. What does that symbolize? Some of our older preachers would say that symbolizes the way to heaven was now open for everyone. I think there's something to be said for that. We don't need to take that too far, but still, there's something to be said for the symbolism there. There's no more limit. There's no more obscurity. There's no more separation. God is going to now be with His people. And Jesus, crying out with a loud voice, said, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. Having said this, He breathed His last. So here we find Luke summarizing this entire event for 6 hours, summarizing into what we would call the highlights, if you can say that. He doesn't specifically look at certain other things that the other gospel writers focus upon. But here he summarizes the end of Jesus at about 3 o'clock that afternoon, crying out with a loud voice. This is not a voice of defeat. This is not a voice of agony. This is not a voice of, you got me? No, this is a voice, a loud voice of victory. He's done it. When he says, according to John's account, it is finished, he's not saying it is finished. He's crying out with a loud voice, it is finished. Father, in your hands I commit my spirit. It's done. No more needs to be done. The work of God has been completed. And so, he is able to die. Now, when the centurion saw what had happened, he began praising God, saying, certainly this man was innocent. King James says, certainly this man was a son of God. The Greek text there is of 2 or 3 ways about it. Most likely, the way the New American Standard Version renders it is correct. Certainly this man was innocent. How much this centurion knew about Jesus, we're not told. Who this centurion was, we are not told. Who could this centurion have been? Could this centurion have been Cornelius? Luke doesn't mention it. Luke doesn't say. All we're told is the centurion knew something different was going on. Something else was afoot. He knew this man didn't deserve what had happened to him. What he saw take place convinced him. He wasn't a criminal. He wasn't a thief. He wasn't somebody that deserved execution. He was innocent. And all the crowds that came together for this spectacle, when they observed what had happened, began to return, beating their breasts. Everybody that was there experienced a change. Not a change as far as becoming Christians, mind you. The gospel had not been proclaimed yet. This had softened their hearts. They knew what they had experienced, what they had witnessed was wrong. This man didn't deserve it. 50 days later, this change of heart would lead to 3,000 souls obeying the gospel on the day of Pentecost. You men of Jerusalem and all you that dwell in Judea, be this known to you and hearken unto these words. Peter would preach to many of the same people who had demanded that Jesus be put to death, and many of those people who had witnessed what had taken place. Acts 2, 3,000 obey. Acts 3, 5,000 obey. There were enough people there that were convinced this is wrong. They didn't know how to change it, how to fix it. All they knew when they went home is this was wrong. And when the gospel would be preached, it would come together. It would click. And all his acquaintances and the women who accompanied him from Galilee were standing at a distance, seeing these things. All of his followers were keeping their arm's length. They were scared what was going to happen to them. John, Peter, the apostles, they were cowering in fear at this point. They didn't know if the Roman soldiers were going to come for them. The chief priests and scribes were going to have them arrested and have them crucified. They didn't know what was going to happen next. But, verse 50, and a man named Joseph, who was a member of the council, a good and righteous man. He had not consented to their plan and action. A man from Arimathea, a city of the Jews, who was waiting for the kingdom of God. This man went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Joseph of Arimathea. I was asked one year, many years ago, to speak on a lectureship about Joseph of Arimathea. I have never heard before or since, and I'm sure there have been those who have preached about him. I had never heard a lesson on Joseph of Arimathea before. And when I started looking at what the text states about him, it was impressive to me. Just what Luke says right here is impressive. Joseph of Arimathea was a member of the Sanhedrin, the council. He was a man of authority, in other words. Notice what Luke says about him. He says he was a good man. He doesn't just say he was a good man, he says he was a righteous man. Joseph was a man who lived what he believed. And then it further says he had not consented to their plan and action. There were dissenting voices in the Sanhedrin that did not prevail. Joseph was one, Nicodemus was another one. Joseph was a man that didn't go along with what had happened. And then it further says that he was waiting for the kingdom of God. Think about that one for a minute. What was Joseph waiting on? He wasn't waiting on the conquering king that would sweep through and completely eliminate the Romans and set up an earthly kingdom. That's not how this strikes me. He was waiting for the kingdom of God. What was he waiting on? It is my conviction Joseph of Arimathea was waiting on the kingdom that had been prophesied in Daniel 2, that the prophets foretold. The kingdom which Jesus preached, the kingdom which John preached. The kingdom of heaven is at hand. My kingdom is not of this world. It is my conviction that Joseph had more of a grasp on the concept of the kingdom than even Jesus' apostles did. He was waiting for the kingdom of God, and he asked for the body of Jesus. He now comes out publicly as a follower of Jesus. He finally says, I've got to take this step and declare to everyone where my loyalty is. And he declares for Jesus. He takes the body of Jesus down. The other accounts tell us that Nicodemus was helping them with this. They had to hurry because the evening was going to take place here in just a moment, because Jesus had died at 3 o'clock and the Sabbath began at 6. The work of Joseph and Nicodemus was hurried. They had to get this done quickly before the Sabbath was going to happen. He took it down and wrapped it in a linen cloth and laid him in a tomb cut into the rock where no one had ever laid. Joseph was a man of means. He was a wealthy man. It was a preparation day, and the Sabbath was about to begin. Now the women who had come with him out of Galilee followed and saw the tomb and how his body was laid. Then they returned and prepared spices and perfumes. So what Joseph and Nicodemus did was to get the body ready for the final preparation for burial. They wrapped him in a fine linen cloth. Nothing is said that John mentions about the separate head napkin, but there was a separate head napkin that was wrapped around Jesus' head. And on the Sabbath they rested according to the commandment. So they put him in the tomb. There's a great stone that is rolled to the entrance of, and a stone scotch is put underneath the stone, and there's a trench that would roll that stone down. When the scotch is taken away, it would roll down to open up the tomb. Roman soldiers are put on guard outside of that tomb, and the practice was to take a seal and stamp it right there at the edge of the door of the tomb, so it would be clear that it had not been broken, no one had tampered with it. So you've got Roman soldiers who are guarding the tomb. The disciples are cowering in fear, and the Sabbath comes and goes uneventful. Yeah, uneventful during the Sabbath. But the greatest event in human history has not yet consummated, because it will consummate on the first day of the week. This is where we'll stop, and we'll resume next week.